Dear ladies and gentlemen, I am most delighted to welcome you at our Transylvania lecture, which is entitled Journalists in Flak Jackets. My name is Rotaru Daniel, and I'm a student at the Matthias Corvinus Collegium University program here in Kolozsvár, Cluj-Napoca. But first of all, you may ask yourself, what is the Transylvania Lecture? The Transylvania Lecture is a series of events organized by the MCC with the scope of creating a platform for learning, debating, and exchanging ideas between various experts and the public. Now let me shortly introduce to you our speakers, Julius Strauss and Tiberiu Crișan. Julius was a long-serving correspondent for the Daily Telegraph who specialized in covering wars and other foreign stories. He graduated in literature, philosophy, and politics from the University of London, then served for 15 years as a war correspondent covering major wars and multiple revolutions ranging from Bosnia to Iraq and from Afghanistan to Chechnya, including the Bosnian War, the Kosovo War, and armed conflicts in Serbia, Macedonia, Albania, Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan. Later, he became Moscow bureau chief for Daily Telegraph, covering Russia under Vladimir Putin and writing about notorious terrorist attacks in the early 2000s. He now divides his time between Canada, where he runs a wilderness lodge that specializes in viewing grizzly bears and leads environmental and charity initiatives, and Europe, where he teaches at MCC Budapest and writes. Dear Julius, thank you for being here. Furthermore, I would also like to introduce Tiberiu Crișan, who will be the moderator of the discussion. Tiberiu is a radio host and photographer. Since the mid-90s, he has worked for different Romanian radio stations, most recently at the EBS radio in Kolozsvár, Cluj-Napoca, where he covers a wide range of interesting topics, from psychology to arts and from urban development to public health. Dear Tiberiu, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Dear gentlemen, my part is over. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Great. Well, nice to have you all here this evening. We're going to try and keep you engaged for the next hour or so. I was a journalist I'm still a journalist, but I was a journalist working in conflict zones for more than 15 years. And when I sat down to decide what to talk about this evening, I realized that if I talk about every conflict I went to, then we would probably be here all night. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the first big story I did to do with war, and then the last big story I did to do with war. I've done a little bit more since then, but this was the last sort of big one. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then after that you guys can join in and ask us lots of difficult questions. Ask anything you want to. Don't feel embarrassed or ashamed. Just before we start, just to give me some idea, who of you have been to Bosnia? Just put your hand up if you've been to Bosnia. Good. 3 or 4 of you. And who's been to Russia? Nobody. 1. Good. One person's been to Russia. Okay, the reason I asked that is the first story I'm going to talk about is a story in Bosnia, and the second story I'm going to talk about is a story in Russia. So the first story I'm going to talk about is Srebrenica. Anybody not heard of Srebrenica? Put your hand up if you don't know what it is. Okay, good. You're either well informed or you're being discreet. So Srebrenica, what I'm going to do, just to kind of get you guys a little bit in the picture, a little bit in the mood, I'm just going to play a couple of minutes. Can we change the thing over, please? I'm going to play a couple of minutes a little news clip about what happened in Srebrenica. It'll just give you the broadest outline. That's me when I was young and healthier. Or maybe not as healthy, I'm not sure. Okay, can everybody see the screen okay? I'm hoping the internet works. It should do. Let's see.
Tomorrow marks the 25th anniversary of the massacre of thousands of Bosnian Muslims by Bosnian Serb forces in Srebrenica. It was the largest mass murder in a conflict characterized by crimes against civilians. Every year the anniversary is marked by a mass gathering and dozens of funerals as more bodies are identified and returned to their families. Our special correspondent Alan Little, who reported extensively on the Bosnian War for the BBC, has this report.
It was the worst atrocity on European soil since the Nazis. 8,000 men and boys separated from their families and in the space of a few days murdered and thrown into mass graves. A United Nations peacekeeping force not only failed to stop it, it actively handed over thousands of Bosnian Muslims to their killers, led by the Bosnian Serb commander Ratko Mladic. The shared international shame of that echoes down the decades. It is not as if we didn't know it would happen. Many saw it coming, for mass murder had been part of the Bosnian Serb military campaign for 3 years before Srebrenica, a campaign they themselves called ethnic cleansing.
The crimes committed rank among the most heinous known to humankind. And
in The Hague, Mladic was one of 7.
Okay, I'm going to stop that right there. So the idea is not to give you a comprehensive account, I just want to give you a little bit about what Srebrenica was. So Srebrenica happened in the middle of the summer in 1995, and you've just kind of seen what happened. The Bosnian Serbs rounded up thousands and thousands and thousands of Muslims, and they machine gunned them. And actually, some of you guys came to on the Bosnia trip earlier this year, and we went to one of the buildings where they had machine gunned the Muslims. They killed more than 1,000 people in this one building. One thing that's remarkable about it is that it's not marked in any way. It's not remembered in any particular way. It's just a building by the side of the road. And if you had never been to this, if you didn't know about Srebrenica, you would never know that anything unusual had happened there. It's just an old agricultural building. But I want to take you back to 1990. So the war ended 1995, the Srebrenica massacre. 1995, December, the war finished. So I was there in early 1996, and we didn't know where the bodies were. No one knew what had happened to all these thousands of people in Srebrenica. There were rumors, there was speculation, but nobody actually knew what had happened. So I was a young journalist, a young correspondent, and I was sent to Sarajevo by my newspaper. And I realized very quickly that I was out of my depth in the sense that I didn't really know anything about Bosnia. I didn't have any contacts. I didn't speak the language. I didn't particularly have a good understanding of the politics, although maybe a little bit. And that if I just went to press conferences and stayed around in Sarajevo, I was just going to be the kind of the newest and the stupidest journalist in town. So I decided I had to try and do something else, something completely different, to try and find something that the other journalists hadn't found or weren't looking for, perhaps, although some people were looking for it. So what I did is I went to the Bosnian Serb center. They called it the capital in those days. It was a place called Pale. And I started hanging out with Bosnian Serbs, and some of them were very nationalist, some of them were police, some of them were former military. And one night I got drunk, always helps to get drunk with a good sauce. I got drunk with a Bosnian Serb, and he turned around to me and he said, "I know what you want. You want to find the bodies from Srebrenica." I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Okay, I'll tell you somebody who might know where they are." And he did. And so eventually I went to see this man. He was in a different town. He was in a town called Vlasenica. I went to Vlasenica. I took a Serb translator from Belgrade because I didn't want to take somebody who was a non-Serb because it would have been an unnecessary aggravation. And we found this guy, and he was very hostile, and he was quite aggressive, and he kind of didn't want to talk, but he kind of did. It was this strange thing where he wanted to talk, but he wanted to talk about what he wanted to talk about. He didn't want to talk about anything I wanted to talk about. And so I made a decision right there and then. And I just sat down with the guy and I just listened to him for hours and hours and hours. And then I bought him lunch, and then I listened to more hours, and then I bought him dinner and more hours. And the next day we went back and more lunch, more dinner. And on about day 3, he was absolutely exhausted. I was absolutely exhausted. My poor translator was about to shoot herself. And all he'd been talking about is Turks and Muslims and how bad they all were. And he finally was just exhausted, and he sat there and he said, "You want me to show you the bodies from Srebrenica, don't you?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And human psychology, craziest thing. He said, "Okay, get in the car." And we got in the car, and I had a rented car from Croatia. It was a Lada Niva, and it was rented, so I took the numbers off it because I didn't want people throwing rocks at me, because the Serbs didn't like the Croats very much. And we drove for about 45 minutes, and then he took me off the road. And this is like maybe April or May. I don't remember the exact date. It was in the spring. But it was very mountainous, it was very muddy, and we started driving up a hill, and there was mud, and there was snow, and the road was getting worse, and it wasn't even really a road anymore, and it just got worse and worse. And then the car started sliding on the snow, and I was just about to say, "I can't do this, this is too dangerous, the driving is too dangerous." And we got to a very steep section, and there was a body lying across the road. And it was an old body, it had been there for a few months. And I couldn't stop the car because of the traction problem I was having, because I was slipping. So I had to make this instantaneous decision, what do I do? So I drove over the body, which I didn't feel good about, but I felt was necessary. So I drove over the body, and then we drove up a little bit, and we stopped, and we got out of the car. And this guy had taken me there, this Bosnian Serb nationalist, and we got out of the car, and there were just hundreds of bodies all over the mountainside. And they'd been there for several months, so they were quite decayed. And to this day, I kind of understand why he took me there, and I kind of don't understand why he took me there. But the fact is, he did. And I think it was because I spent those 3 days. He decided he respected that somehow. And when I said to him, these are civilians you've killed, you Bosnian Serbs have killed these civilians, he said, no, they're all soldiers, they're soldiers. And it was obvious that they weren't soldiers. Some of them were too young, none of them were wearing uniform. You could kind of tell from their possessions that they weren't soldiers. And I wrote a story about that day, and that was probably my breakthrough story for the Daily Telegraph, and my breakthrough story was I a war correspondent at that point? Probably not, but in a kind of a conflict setting. Anyway, I could go on with the story because it continued to be interesting for quite a while, but I just wanted to give you that little flash. And then if you fast forward how many years? So that was 1996, 2004 in Russia, Chechen terrorists seized control of a school in southern Russia in a place called Beslan. And I'm just going to play you a little clip of that.
It was the first day of term in school number 1 in Beslan. In Russia, there are no classes when pupils come back from the summer. It's supposed to be a day of celebration and catching up with friends. But rebels stormed the school and forced more than 1,100 children, parents and teachers into a small gym. They wanted Russian troops to leave the nearby Republic of Chechnya.
We were standing next to the school gates. I saw 3 people running in with machine guns. At first I thought it was a joke. Then they began shooting into the air, and I ran away.
This was the start of a siege that went on for 52 hours. It was cramped and swelteringly hot in the gym with no food or drink. There were bombs taped to the wall and hanging from the ceiling. Older pupils were forced to attach explosives to the basketball hoops, and children were forced to stand near the windows as human shields. A few children, like this little girl, did manage to escape. But as negotiations went on, other relatives were left waiting outside, desperate for news, terrified every time they heard gunfire. Hundreds of Russian security forces surrounded the school, and on the 3rd day, they stormed the building. Explosives and gunfire rang out. There was no sign of medical teams or ambulances. The attackers shot some of the children in the back as they ran for freedom, but others were carried out, weak, half-naked and bleeding. Some relatives fought to get through the security cordon to find out what was happening to their loved ones. 331 people died, 186 of them were children. Russia was in mourning. There were days of mass funerals, but many families and victims blame authorities, partly for not doing enough to prevent the attack, but also for the botched rescue operation. It's come out that security forces fired tanks and flamethrowers at the school. Only one of the attackers was found alive. Chechen carpenter Nupashi Kulayev is serving a life sentence. Authorities were cleared of any wrongdoing. For 13 years now, families and hostages have fought that decision. They could be awarded compensation, but most say it's more about establishing responsibility.
Okay. Where do I stop this? 1 sec. So who had heard of Beslan before? Some of you had, some of you hadn't. I mean, you should have heard of it because it's possibly the worst terrorist attack ever that's ever happened. And the reason it's the worst terrorist attack possibly that ever happened is not because it killed the most people, but because they were children. Children were targeted specifically. And as it said in this report, 180 children died. So I just want to kind of give you a little insight into what it looked like as a reporter. I was in Moscow. By then I was Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph, so I had a relatively important job in journalism. I mean, it was, it was kind of, these jobs don't really exist anymore. It was a job that a lot of journalists would have dreamed of having. I had a very good budget. My salary was okay. I had a secretary. I had another secretary for the days when the first secretary wasn't doing too well. I had a chauffeur and all that stuff. So that was kind of nice because having a good budget means you can do good stories, hopefully. You get to travel around, you get to pick your stories. And I remember I had this phone call, it was like 9 o'clock in the morning, and Moscow is 3 hours ahead. So it was 9 o'clock for me, it was 6 or 6:30 in the morning for London. And somebody on the news desk who was up early phoned up and they said there's been a terrorist attack in Russia. And I was like, well, it happens. There's quite a lot of them. And they said, no, this is a school. It seems worse. So I went into the office. I found out what was going on. Now immediately, so this was in southern Russia. So immediately you have a little bit of a problem here because ideally you should be on the scene. But you know that if you set out to get to where you should be, then it's going to take the whole day to get there. And you might end up with not being able to write anything about what is actually happening. So the newspaper said to me, you've got to stay in Moscow. You've got to write this story. So maybe tomorrow morning you can go to Beslan, but you can't go now because we're going to need huge amounts of writing and reporting on this subject. Which is not what I wanted to do, but they imposed their will. So the first day I stayed in Moscow, and then I got a very, very early flight the next morning. And it was complicated because the Russians did not want to give access to journalists, so they were messing with journalists. Actually, there was a Russian journalist called Anna Politkovskaya, and they poisoned her on the airplane because they didn't want her to cover the story. She survived. She was killed later for something else she did. But she did survive initially. So I got down there. I didn't fly to the local airport because I figured there'd be too much security at the local airport. So I flew to an airport that was a little bit further away. And then I got a taxi for about 5 or 6 hours to the school, to the town where this school was. And so that afternoon I wrote some stories about what was happening in the town. And then that evening I thought to myself, it was kind of strange psychologically because I thought, I know that there's 1,000 hostages there. I know that half of them are children, and it's just impossible that the Russians are going to storm the building because if they do, hundreds of people are going to die, and that's just not possible. And then I thought, well, hang on a minute. Think this through logically. Are the Chechens going to give up? No. They were suicide attackers, basically. Is Putin going to back down? No, he's not. It's just not in his psychological profile. And I realized at that point, as terrible as it seemed, there was going to be a shootout. Didn't matter how impossible it seemed, there was just going to be. So I walked around the perimeter of the whole area, and you have to imagine it's heavily militarized. There's a little bit of shooting happening sometimes. You walked around the whole area, checked out the whole thing, because I wanted to figure out, when the shooting started, what the fields of fire were like, where the shooting was going to be, where the main streets were, where the entrances were to this school, where people were likely to run to, and so on and so on. I got detained by the Russians 2 or 3 times, but they let me go. I had press accreditation. 10 minutes, they let me go. So when the shooting did start the next day, and I kind of knew it was going to, there were 2 big explosions, I remember, and then the shooting started. I was one of only 2 journalists who were on the other side of the security cordon. In other words, the Russians put up a security cordon that stopped hundreds and hundreds of journalists getting through, and only 2 of us were on the inside of the security cordon. It was me and a Russian photographer called Yuri Kozyrev. And so I ended up with this eyewitness view of what was happening. And as you can imagine, it wasn't particularly pretty. So there was a shootout. It went on the shootout went on all day, but the main bit of the shootout went on for about half an hour. But then the school where the children were, the Russians were firing incendiary. They said they fired tank shells. They actually fired some special tank shells that are used for knocking down buildings without killing too many people. It's complicated, the kind of artillery they used. But the problem was the school caught fire, and the roof collapsed onto the children. So 186 of them died that day. I think it's 186 in the end. So that was the last big story I covered. I'd been having problems, kind of psychological trauma problems, for a few years by then. Sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse. It wasn't always terrible, but sometimes it was. And I just realized that the effect of seeing that amount of, I didn't see all of the dead children, but seeing lots and lots of dead children in those kind of circumstances, that was probably going to be my last big story as a war correspondent. I did go back to war afterwards, for a whole bunch of complicated reasons, and I don't regret that, but that was the end of my kind of uninterrupted war coverage. So a couple of little things I just wanted to say, starting out with the bit from Srebrenica, and I will stop in 2 minutes, I promise. Starting out with the bit from Srebrenica, what did I learn from all that? I think it's very important, especially when you're young. I was only 25, maybe 26, something like that. I was a bit older than you guys, but not much. That when you're trying to establish yourself, you follow your instinct and trust your instinct and just go with it. I was going out, I was taking a chance, because every day I sat with that fat nationalist guy in Vlasenica. The newspaper was paying hundreds and hundreds of dollars, translators, cars, food, hotels, blah, blah, blah. But you just have to go with your instinct, and you have to work very hard, and you have to just keep pushing and pushing and trying and trying. And in the end, if you do that for long enough, it tends to work. The people I know who have become very successful war correspondents have all used that same method. None of them try to do too many things. They concentrate on doing one thing properly at a time. So that's one thing I learned from that. And if you think you have something important, then stick with it. Don't give up halfway. Take your time. And then the one thing I would say with Beslan is, again, go with your instinct and don't go with the crowd. Don't follow the crowd. Do your own thing. You might find that the crowd has got something that you haven't. There you go. Some days you lose. But do your own thing and trust your own instincts. And if you see this kind of mentality where everybody's going one way, your immediate reaction should be to stop and think, hang on a minute, why are they going that way? And unless you think it's absolutely compelling, then do something different. Go with your own thing. But also know your own limits. Know how far you can go. Know how far you can push yourself. And I knew after Beslan, I wasn't going to have immediate problems. I wasn't going to have problems that day or the next day. But I knew that I'd reached my own kind of personal limits. And I made the right decision in that regard, I think. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Very touching stories you told us. Julius, We start with this question. What's the job description of a war journalist? What exactly means to be a war journalist?
It's an interesting question. I mean, a lot of war correspondents don't like being called war correspondents. There's a bit of a snobbery to this. A war correspondent technically is somebody who only covers wars. The problem is that there's almost no journalists that only cover wars, because when the wars are not happening, they often cover something else. I mean, there's a friend of mine, very close friend of mine called Anthony. He could properly be called a war correspondent, but even he covers things that are not wars. Maybe they're related to conflict in some way. So you will often hear journalists say, or war correspondents will give you a different definition than ordinary journalists and than members of the public will. I think it's legitimate to call somebody a war correspondent if most of what they do, or a large part of what they do, is wars. Now, that said, for example, I have a friend in Budapest who works for Associated Press. Now, he's not a war correspondent, but he has been in Ukraine twice this year. And the reason he's been in Ukraine is because he works for an agency that cycles people through. In other words, part of working for the Associated Press is that you're going to go to Ukraine occasionally. But when he goes to Ukraine, he doesn't push really hard. He doesn't go to the front line all the time. He doesn't he covers the story well, and he covers it conscientiously. I wouldn't call him a war correspondent. But in a sense, I suppose anybody who's covered war can be a war correspondent. I think there's it's a bit like anything in life. I think the more experience you get and the better you get, the less you kind of talk about it, show off about it, and want to be labeled as something particular. But on the other hand, if that's what you are, then that's what you are. It's kind of complicated.
What's the job description?
Job description. Okay, I'll give you some good news. Who wants to be a war correspondent out there? I can see all the hands going up at the same time. Absolutely nobody. Never mind. So if anybody's interested in journalism, the great thing about being a war correspondent is you can be a bit of a lazy journalist.
Hey, how is that?
Because all you have to do is go somewhere where there's lots of crazy stuff happening, get up in the morning, go for a 3-hour walk, and you have a story. That's it. You don't need sources, you don't need telephone numbers, all those things are useful, but you don't need them. If you're really in a very dramatic situation, sometimes 10 minutes is enough and you have a good story. And so the kind of the qualities, what are the qualities of a normal journalist? You'll correct me if you have a different view, and there are different views, of course, but persistence is one.
Curiosity? No?
Curiosity, yes. Curiosity is shared by journalists and war correspondents. But persistence is not something you necessarily have to be a good war correspondent. Having good networking skills, it helps being a war correspondent. It's not necessary. I think it's more necessary when you're a normal journalist. The thing I like about being a war correspondent, is you're not hanging around with important people. I think journalists should not be hanging around with important people, or if they do, it should be the minority of what they do. When you see diplomatic correspondents and defense correspondents, and all they do is they hang out with diplomats and often people of their own nationality who are feeding them stories, then that's kind of, I don't know. I don't have as much respect for that as I do for people who kind of represent the interest of ordinary people. I think that is part of journalism. It's an important part. And so nobody put their hand up when I said who wants to be a war correspondent. But if you want to be a journalist, because you may not want to be journalists either, but if you do, the idea that you spend all day hanging around with important people, eating canapes, and you drink at somebody else's expense, yeah, but that's not really what journalism is about. You can still drink at somebody else's expense, but you can't hang out with important people and eat canapes all day.
So you need to be persistent, you need to be curious for being a good war journalist. Yeah. What other abilities are required? You need to have courage, guts?
I don't know about that. I was quite timid when I was a kid. I wasn't a brave kid. And I think as a teenager, I was like, I wasn't drawn to danger in any way. I wasn't drawn to testing myself particularly. I think one thing, I'm on live here, so I can't use too many swear words. One question I get asked, and I think is a totally legitimate question, is, did you become a war correspondent? Are you messed up because you became a war correspondent, or because you were a war correspondent, or did you become a war correspondent because you were messed up in the first place? And
That's a good one, yeah.
I have to say that a lot of people I know who are very good war correspondents, they do have a lot of issues that they've had from childhood, nothing to do with wars. They carry a certain amount of insecurity with them, and that produces sometimes a lot of drive and a lot of ambition and a lot of determination. The other thing I don't know if I like that about them or not, but that's a fact. But one thing I do like about them is they tend to be natural rebels. They're not good at following rules. They don't work well in a kind of a mainstream setting. And I guess that was probably part of my motivation as well. I didn't want to be part of a system. I wanted to be in a place where I could make my own decisions, I think. I think that's part of it. I can't remember what your question was. I'm sure I didn't answer it.
It's okay, I'm pleased with your answer. What are the major challenges of this kind of work? Okay, you put yourself in danger.
Yes.
It can be risky, that's obvious.
So just to go back to this thing about courage and bravery, I think that, the first time, I'll give you a different example. When I moved to Canada, so what I do now in Canada is I work around grizzly bears, brown bears, the same thing you have in Romania. The first time I ever saw a bear, and I wasn't that young, and I'd been a war correspondent already, it was a bear. It was a small bear, it was a black bear, it was quite a long way away, it wanted nothing to do with me, and I just ran like hell. I just turned around in the opposite direction and just ran as fast as I could. And I knew that you shouldn't run from bears, but it didn't matter, I ran away anyway. And being a war correspondent is kind of the same. You go there, you hear shooting, and it terrifies you, and you go home. And then you sit there and you think, oh, why did I go home? Life here is boring, I need to go back. And then you go back, and then you hear shelling.
So you need that adrenaline again?
It starts out, I think at the beginning the adrenaline is important, but you do evolve. That's not the reason that people do it after 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. I don't think, that's my opinion. I think there is a phase when you're young, particularly when maybe the adrenaline is exciting, but I think what keeps you doing it is you find some kind of meaning there. You find something that makes you feel better about your own life somehow, because you feel you're doing something useful. I think that's the main thing that keeps people there, but some people are different.
What abilities are required for being a good war journalist?
Well, there are always people who break the mold, but one thing I would say is that you have to be able to fit into all kinds of different situations. You have to be able to walk up to a woman whose child has just been killed and talk to her in a way that is not offensive to her. You have to be able to talk to people who are soldiers. You have to be able to talk to victims. You have to be able to operate in so many different environments. And we all know, because we're humans, when somebody walks in the room and you think, that person's going to be a problem, they're going to be a pain in the ass. I can tell from the way they're walking, I can tell from their attitude. I might be wrong, but I think I'm going to have a problem with this person. You need to be the opposite of that. You need to be able to walk in and just, some of the best photographers I know, you'll notice them come in the room and start taking photographs, and after 10 minutes, you won't even know that they're there. They're never in your way, they're always low profile, they don't make any... And I think that is a big, useful skill for being a war correspondent. I think another thing which is absolutely necessary if you're going to do it long term is you have to have a strong ethical sense of what's right, what's wrong. You have to there has to be some morality in what you're doing. It can't just be purely observational, I think. Because you make judgment calls, right? You have to make judgment calls. We're human, you have to do that.
What would you advise a rookie who is about to depart to, let's say, Ukraine as a war journalist?
Don't go.
Don't go.
No, the reason I say that is because I actually think being a war journalist, a war correspondent, is a valid and honourable profession. for the most part. There's always some that don't fit that category. But this year, a young Hungarian guy in Budapest came to me, Boldizsár, and he knew about me from somewhere, and he came and he said, I would like you to mentor me, because I want to go to Ukraine, and I want to go to the front line, and I want to be a war correspondent. So I'm like, okay, Baldy, tell me about yourself. And he said, I've got 3 degrees, I'm top of everything, I'm the fastest guy in the whatever athletics team, and I'm bored. This life means nothing to me. I want a life that means something to me. So I want to go to
selection.
Well, no, I think it was more he wanted to test himself in some way, feel that he was doing something that was testing for him. And so he said, I want to go to Ukraine. So I said, look, don't go. And he said, well, I didn't say don't go. I said, I'm not going to help you. And he said, please help me. So in the end, I spent about, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 hours with him, like 5 or 6 times 1 hour. And I tried to give him what I could give him in terms of the journalism side, and some of the logistical stuff, and what to expect. And yeah, I gave him what I could in 5 or 6 hours. And to his great credit, he collected all his money together in the world, which was about 450 euros or something. And off he went to Ukraine. And he went to Zaporozhye, which was more or less on the front line. And he stayed there for several weeks. And he's still trying to break through into the Western media. He doesn't want to write for the media in Hungary, he wants to write for the Western media. And he's just got a job, it's not a job exactly, but he's just got a position as the standby journalist for Associated Press in Budapest. If that works out, that's awesome. He's also had a small child, so he's like, child war. So he's balancing things, and you often have to balance things. But I'm sure he will go back to Ukraine, and I hope he will succeed in what he's trying to do.
So what was your answer?
Gosh, I mean, logistics.
First you told me don't go.
No, well,
but I'm
go.
pushy like your friend in Budapest.
Yeah, I mean, only go if you really want to go, if you can't think of a better idea. If you're going to go, you've got to look at the logistics. You've got to think about how things work. The first thing that most people forget about, if they're members of the public, is communications. You've got to be able to get your story back. If you have cell phones, great, fantastic. But if you don't, you have to find another way. If there's local landlines, less and less in this world, that's another way of getting it back. Otherwise, you're going to need some kind of satellite communications. They can get very expensive. In certain areas, they're banned. They can be dangerous because they can be tracked, and so on and so on. So communications is one thing you want to think about. Because if you have the best story in the world and you can't communicate, it's not going to go anywhere. Unless you happen to be, I don't know how many of you followed the story of the 2 Associated Press journalists in Mariupol at the beginning of the war. And they stayed for weeks and weeks and weeks. And their story was so incredibly powerful that even though the story came out 3 weeks later, it didn't matter. Because they were in a place that no other journalist was. And they went through these I highly, highly recommend you look up the story. In fact, if someone reminds me afterwards, then I'll send you a link to the group to read it. It's incredible. It's an incredible piece of journalism. Anyway, going back to your question. So communications is one thing. You need a little bit of money. If you speak something of the language, it helps a lot. Even if you can't conduct full interviews, if you can just have a sense of what's going on around you and be polite in the language, that's it. That really helps. So I suggested to Boldizsár he learn Russian, and he is learning Russian. He could have learned Ukrainian as well, one or the other. And then there's lots and lots of little things. What kind of passport do you take? What kind of accreditation do you have? What do you take that might get you into trouble at checkpoints? How do you behave at a checkpoint? What do you do when you drive up at night and there's some guy with a gun and he's drunk? Where do you stop your vehicle at a checkpoint? There's so many thousands of details. One thing you don't do at a dangerous checkpoint is you don't drive right into it and stop. You always stop short. And if they wave you forward and you think it's okay, you go forward. But I've been at a checkpoint a long time ago in the Balkans, and the checkpoint, it was a crazy checkpoint. Everybody was drunk, they were all over the place. And everybody was happy to see us except one guy, and he turned around to shoot, And so I was just about to roll out of the side of the car. It happened pretty quickly. And luckily, another guy got a gun and smashed him on the side of the head. And so he didn't shoot. But if someone's going to shoot at you, then you want obviously as much distance as you can have between you and them. So there's lots and lots, and we're not going to do it tonight, but there's all these tiny details. What clothing do you wear? How do you think about it? You know, if you wear nylon clothing, synthetic clothing is great in terms of keeping warm, but if there's fire risk, that stuff's going to burn onto you. So if there's explosives going off, you don't want to be in nylon clothing. It's all, you know, what do you do? How do you get your water? How do you use water purifying tablets? Do you not? How much do you carry? What do you say when someone threatens you? It's just thousands of things and some of it is common sense, some of it you only pick up with long experience. I'll give you one example. A lot of people have said to me over the years, how can you walk up to somebody who has just lost their son or their mother or their sibling or their wife, like just lost them, they've just been killed, and you walk up to them and start asking them questions as a journalist? I'll tell you honestly, it's the most natural thing in the world for you and for them, because you're asking as a human being. And I've had people tell me, piss off, go away, but 9 times out of 10, the person not only is willing to talk, they want to talk. They're trying to find some kind of explanation, some reason, some meaning, something. And if your interest is genuine and it's patient and it's gentle, and it's not like, hey, just give me a story, they're not going to react well to that, then they usually react very, very well to somebody who's interested in their case. No war journalist would ever ask another war journalist that question. You just know that from experience. That's one example.
The media is used, on the other hand, to exploit vulnerable people in these situations. And maybe that's why the question came to you, how can you talk to such traumatized people? Because often we see on TV that the media is pushing the limits with the people who are not in a great position. So
I totally agree. I mean, they're just like anything else. There are good journalists and there are bad journalists. There are good soldiers, there are bad soldiers. There are good diplomats, there are bad diplomats. Do I like journalists in a generality? No, I don't like them very much, actually. Not like, there's lots of things about journalists I don't particularly like at a personal level. Do I like war correspondents? Much more. But maybe I'm biased.
A little, just a little bit biased.
It depends, it depends on the... It's such a funny thing. I spent 15 years in Canada in the wilderness, and everything I learnt in the wilderness, I learnt from scientists. And you see something, and they say, what's that? And they encourage you not to say anything. Stop and think and check and be careful with your analysis and say, well, I don't think it's, work slowly, journalists do the opposite. Journalists, February the 23rd this year, how many hundreds of journalists said, the Russians will never attack Ukraine? February the 24th, the Russians attacked Ukraine. I don't mind if a journalist says, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think the Russians won't attack Ukraine. That's fine. I have no issue with that. Somebody who says 100% the Russians are not going to attack, I have a problem with that. They shouldn't make statements like that. And journalists are often too quick to make these kind of predictive statements.
Speaking of the war in Ukraine, how do you think the media covered this conflict? The Western media specifically. Is biased or no?
It's a huge story. Some journalists are working in very difficult circumstances, and some journalists are doing fantastic jobs. And it's not really defined by the media that they work for, although of course, good journalists often work for good media, but not always. Is the overall coverage biased? I think there's a group of journalists who they've probably never been to a war zone before. They freshly arrive in Kiev, however you want to say it. They freshly arrive there, and there's a sort of a social pressure on them to start saying the Russians are bad, the Ukrainians are good. Yeah, that's true. The people I know who work the front lines, are they like that? No, they're not like that at all. If anything, they have a slight problem with the Ukrainians because they're working on the Ukrainian side of the line. It's often the Ukrainians who give them the rules that they have to work with, and they don't like it. You know, war correspondents don't like rules. I mean, you can almost guarantee that with every single one of them. So when you have someone telling you can't go here or you can't go there, they're like, they get a bit antsy about it. On the other side, do I think the picture of the overall conflict, do I think Russia is to blame? Yes. I think Russia, I think every conflict has its dynamic. It's not good enough just to say that there's two sides to every story. It's not deep enough. It's not profound enough. The first war I covered the end of it, was the war in Bosnia. Did the Muslims get screwed in Bosnia more than the Serbs and the Croats? Yes, absolutely. You only have to look at the casualty figures. It's absolutely clear. Did the Chinese get screwed in the Second World War more than the Japanese? In casualty figures, yes, they clearly did. So some wars are even, some wars are equal, some wars both sides are wrong, but other wars they're not. And the extreme example, which I bring up when people say, oh, every war has two sides, is we didn't say that about Auschwitz. We didn't say, oh, well, the Jews think, but the Germans say, but no, you don't do that. You have to make an objective value judgment and say, hang on a minute, it seems that this is what's happening. And so I feel that the Ukraine-Russia war, it's not Auschwitz, I'm not making that comparison, but it is a pretty one-sided war, and the Russians have made no attempt to put their view across to the Western media, like almost none. I don't think they can.
How can you tell the difference between good and bad in battle?
Oh, God. You need to write a thick book about that one. How can you tell the difference between good and bad? Give me an example. What do you mean?
You're sent out as a war correspondent, and from what you already know, one side is the bad guys, the other one are the good guys, and you are sent with the good guys, and in the field you discover that maybe the good guys are not always good guys, and they do terrific things also to the enemy. They're not, let's say, treating prisoners very well.
Sure. I mean, I think that...
do you have a sense of what's good and bad in being there?
Hopefully. I mean, you have to put in hard work. You can't go in for 5 minutes and then leave. You have to spend some time there. And sometimes what you think is obvious is not so obvious, and sometimes your view of things changes. But the other thing is, what we mustn't do with wars is say that, for example, the Bosnian Muslims have committed war crimes, and therefore all sides are the same, because they all commit war crimes. You can't do that. It's just lazy. It's lazy thinking, it's lazy journalism. When we went to Bosnia earlier this year, the good example is Srebrenica. The Serbs killed 8,000 Muslim men and boys. Now, the Muslims also killed Serbs in Srebrenica, civilians, and it's a famous incident because the Serb media has talked about it ever since. But if you look at the details, we don't know exactly how many, but it was between 5 and 15 people. You can't put those on a scale and say, oh, they're all war criminals, they're all the same. So you have to contextualize it somehow, and it's a very interesting thing with journalism. You can write a story where every single comma, every single full stop, every single name, every single quote is 100% accurate, but the picture you give can be a lie. And you can also write a story where every quote is made up, everything is fabricated, but the picture you give represents the truth in a strange way. So truth isn't just about commas and quotes and getting the names right. It's also about weighing things. I'll give you another example. The New York Times has changed a little bit recently. I think they have their first non-American Jewish correspondent there for a while. He's actually a British guy. The New York Times was traditionally quite pro-Israeli. How did they do that? Why were they pro-Israeli? Or never mind why were they pro-Israeli. What made them pro-Israeli? What they did is they covered the Israel story fairly, but they covered it as a policy story. They didn't cover it as a human story. They just wrote about the politics, who said what was happening in the parliament, and so on and so on. Now that takes away The Guardian, for example, which is much more, well, they're both left-wing papers, but much more anti-Israeli, They covered it as a human story. So if you write about human beings all day in Israel, your coverage is going to be pro-Palestinian, because way more Palestinians die than Israelis. If you write about policy all day in Israel, your coverage is going to come across as much more balanced. Which one is the truth? They're both the truth, right? They're both part of the truth. They're not lies, but so context is important.
Do you have dilemmas on these topics?
Yeah,
How do
huge dilemmas.
How do you solve them?
How do you solve them? I mean, I don't really believe in objectivity. Well, I shouldn't say I don't believe in it at all. What I don't believe in is neutrality. I think that everything has a different dynamic, and you owe it to yourself to work hard enough to figure out what that dynamic is. And I'm always very suspicious of somebody who has a particular worldview and goes somewhere and has that worldview strengthened and leaves. When somebody says something that is contrary to their worldview, then it's much more interesting and much more credible somehow. So I'll give you an example. You know, during the war in Kosovo, I saw a lot of dead Albanians. I saw a lot of Albanians killed by Serbs. And then when I went back at the end of the war, there was some killing of Serbs by Albanians, and I didn't like it. Because as a human being, I was like, they shouldn't be doing this. They're the victims. They shouldn't be doing this killing. But they were. So you have to report it. And that's where you have to have enough humility in you, and you have to have enough fairness and talk to enough people and work hard enough and just try and figure out what's going on. Because your ultimate duty is to the truth. It's not to your preconceptions about the world. That's the ideal, anyway.
How do you deal with your own wars, with your inner wars?
Oh, gosh.
If you have, of course.
Where did you find this guy?
She saw me interviewing two guys before you, so that what determined her to
How do you deal with your inner
bring me
wars?
here.
I don't know. There's so many ways I could answer that question. I mean, one thing that happens to me, because I've already alluded to this in what we were talking about, is from about 2000 on, well, not from about, from exactly 2000 on, when I was in Sierra Leone, I had problems with post-traumatic stress disorder. In the beginning, I was in complete denial. I just refused to accept that it was happening, but it clearly was happening. And people said, there's something wrong with your head. I'm like, no, my head is fine. There's something wrong with my ears, maybe. So I went to all kinds of different doctors that had nothing to do with trauma. And finally, I had to kind of accept it. How do I feel about that? The way I feel about it is this. There's nothing wrong with getting hurt in life. There's nothing wrong whether you're getting hurt physically or you're getting hurt mentally or you're getting hurt emotionally. But what is important is how you deal with that, what you do with that, the lessons that you draw from it, the way you move forward with it. Today, there's a distinction that people are beginning to draw, and it's a very good distinction, between post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic stress happens to all of us in our lives. Something bad happens to us, either physically or emotionally or mentally or whatever, and we get thrown by it, and we get injured, and we get hurt by it. But then our natural healing ability kicks in, and slowly we overcome that. Post-traumatic stress disorder is when you don't overcome it, because you get locked into a cycle where you're not able to overcome it. I definitely had post-traumatic stress. I also had some post-traumatic stress disorder. The way I look back on it now is that I'm not sorry that it happened. I think I learned a hell of a lot from it. I think pain and suffering and loss are actually very, very good teachers in life. Do you want it all the time? No, of course not. Do you want it lots and lots of it? No. But you have to give it its value. It has some value. So I suppose you asked about my inner wars or my inner battles. It's related to that. It's related to the fact of, okay, you feel terrible right now, you feel hurt, you feel injured. What do you do with that? How do you find a way of accepting what it is, but also trying to turn it into some kind of positive? And I'm fascinated by how human beings do that. And I've seen humans go through some of the worst things you can possibly imagine in terms of torture or losing members of their family or losing everything they have, and somehow come out the other side and seem to make something relatively positive of their lives. And so, yeah, doesn't quite answer your question, but close, I think.
After all the negative things that happened to you, and you told us here some terrific stories, you turned towards preserving nature, more specifically grizzly bears, a radical movement.
Yeah, not just bad things happen to me, by the way. Lots of good things happen to me as well.
Yeah, of course, of course. What do you think, after all these wars, about humankind?
Oh, I'm positive about humankind. I'm optimistic about humankind. I'm not one of those people who sees all this and goes away and says humans are terrible. I need to get away from them.
After all you've seen, yeah?
Yeah, no, I don't. You see lots of horrible things in wars, but you also see lots of amazing things. You see people behave to the best of their ability, to the best of their ethics, their morality. It's fascinating. It's wonderful. I'll never forget in Bosnia, I was interviewing a guy in East Mostar, a Muslim, and they just had a war with the Croats, horrible war. And his wife had been killed, and his boy, who was still alive, was he was messed up. I mean, he couldn't talk, you could see he had huge mental problems. And my translator was a Croat. And I knew going there that it was dangerous for this guy to go there. But he said, I want to go. I was like, okay, you take a risk, you take a risk. You want it? I'll take you, but I don't think it's a good idea, but it's your personal choice. And as we were doing this interview, I could see what was happening. And the Muslim suddenly realized he's talking to a Croat. And he's talking to the first Croat he's talked to since the beginning of the war, since the beginning of the cross-town war. And the Croats have killed his wife and messed up his kid. And I saw this, and I saw the realization in the man's face, and I saw the realization on the translator's face as well, and I was like, oh, here we go. And the man walked over to my translator, he put his arm around him, and he said, I know it wasn't your fault. And, for me, I was just absolutely, I can't tell you how that made me feel. I just wish that as a human being, one day I have that level of forgiveness in me, because I don't think I do. So you see these incredible things. You see these incredible acts of generosity in wars. You see some of the worst of human nature and some of the best of human nature. So no, does it make me pessimistic about humans? No. I mean, I'm not, kind of airy-fairy that everybody's beautiful. No, I don't think everybody is beautiful. But I'm not pessimistic about the human condition. And one thing that's interesting is that, one thing that's depressing for me is that when humans on their way up in life, new car, new job, lots of money and so on, they adapt to it very quickly. You get your brand new car, a month later it's just the old car. But humans on the way down, they also adapt to new circumstances. You can see that in Ukraine at the moment, where people have been living normal lives and suddenly everything is ripped away from them. Do they just sit in a corner and cry and curl up and die and freeze? No, they don't. Things come out of them, elements come out that you can sometimes not predict. So in some strange way, I find what I've seen in conflict zones kind of, positive about human nature, and in some ways not, of course.
If you could go back in time and if you could take all your wisdom with you, what job would you choose?
The wisdom that you're referring to is...
one gained in all these years. Would you still be a war correspondent?
I think I would, actually. I think I probably would. I think I would. I don't have any regrets about it. I think I probably left at the right time, not just because of the mental trauma, but because I've been doing it for a long time. It does take a toll on you. But also, I think my learning curve was beginning to flatten. I had some of the best stories I would have ever done were behind me. And so I just felt that it was time to do something different. I had lots of personal reasons for giving up journalism. One of them was the problems I was having with my head. But would I do it again? Yeah, I think I would. I think I would do it again. What would I do differently? I think I would maybe have more self-belief from the beginning. It's an interesting profession, it's an honorable profession, it's a useful profession. And, as we all know, I mean, we're only 3 or 4 left turns away from a nuclear war. You have to know what's going on in the world. We all have to know. We can't afford to lock ourselves in our little houses and watch reality TV all day, you know. And people who fulfill that function in a honest and conscientious and hard-working way, yeah, maybe they're flawed as individuals. They're often flawed as individuals. But it's a very necessary service to society, I think. So yeah, I would do it again. Also, what the hell else would I do? Who's going to give me a job doing what exactly? I mean, I'm not super employable, so yeah.
One last question.
Yeah.
What is the quality you're most grateful for?
Quality in
Your
others?
quality.
Oh gosh, Christina. What is the quality I'm most grateful for?
And I'm not letting you go without answering this question, I'm sorry.
Grateful for? Oh. You know, my mother can be a difficult woman. My father's Hungarian, my mother's Welsh, so I'm a combination. My father was very Hungarian, he's dead now, but he was very Hungarian. He's quite practical, quite tough, practical. He fought in 1956, he became a refugee. My mum grew up in Wales, she didn't fight any wars, she talks a lot. She likes to have a few drinks sometimes, although not so much anymore. But I think I did inherit something from her, and it's a type of an idealism. Or maybe idealism is not quite the right word, but a sort of an optimistic sense that we're put on this earth to do something a little bit beyond our own immediate self-interest. And much as I love my dad, I think I probably got that from my singing, drinking, dancing Welsh mother. And yeah, I'm glad she's not here because she would burst into tears and jump on the stage. And that would mess up the YouTube video. But yeah, so I'm very grateful that I got that from her and I inherited that from her.
Because it means optimism, yeah?
It's a kind of get out and do stuff, change stuff, do stuff you believe in. You know, it's that kind of, what is it? It's a bit of a drive, but it's not a drive to make more money or, you know, it's not a career drive. It's more do something that will make you feel okay about yourself or something like that. I don't know. You didn't tell me that question was coming and I haven't prepared for it.
I'm glad.
But yeah. So, I mean, what I would say to you guys is, you know, do whatever you want to do. There's nothing stopping. If you do it conscientiously and you work hard and you follow your beliefs, yeah, you're going to end up in the mud sometimes. You're going to get hurt. You're going to, you know, things will go wrong. But ultimately, you're all smart enough. I mean, you've got the ability to do it. So when somebody tells you when you're young, and I got this a lot when I was young, you can't do that. You're not good enough. No, don't think you can do that. Even when I went to work for the Daily Telegraph, the foreign editor took me aside. He said, I've read a couple of your stories. And I was like, oh, great. He said, you're shit. I'm not hiring you. I'm like, all right, thanks. So I left and I went home. I was like, and then I thought, screw him. I'm going to do it anyway.
I have to tell you, Julius is writing stories, even if he's not employed as a journalist. He has a sort of blog on Substack, no?
Yeah.
Before we met, I've read 2 or 3 stories, and he's fascinating. I like the way he writes today, of course, about wars. But you should check his articles.
Give me your Revolut, and we'll sort this out afterwards.
So, if you have questions, feel free to ask him anything. Almost anything, as you saw earlier. We have a few minutes left.
Yes, please.
As a copywriter and NCC here, so also a journalist. I'm a bear lover, a bear fan, so I admire this kind of retirement as well.
Retirement? Please don't tell me I'm retired.
Or
Oh yeah, that's better.
It's the ideal life. Journalism, I think. What I was wondering about, how can you choose in difficult situations when you have to choose between duty, between the big picture, or immediately helping someone and giving first aid?
It's a very difficult question.
That's why I think I couldn't be, because I can't focus on the big picture and I have to have someone.
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer, but you have to use your head, not just your heart, because I'll give you an example. I was in Kosovo, and we talked about this in my class yesterday. There was a massacre, and 45 people were killed. And the next day I went into the village, and I had a little Peugeot little car from France. This poor little car, it was from Paris. It spent most of its life driving around Paris, belonged to a very elegant lady, and then I bought it and took it to Kosovo. Anyway. I was in the village, and the villagers were begging me to get them out because the Serbs were coming back, there was a lot of shooting, the road was very dangerous, there was one road out of town. And they were too scared to walk out, quite rightly, it was really dangerous. And so my instinct was to try and help them. So I drove, I mean, there's complications to the story, but eventually I drove out with my translator, and Reuters, the news agency, had an armoured car. And there was a lot of shooting, so I needed an armoured car. In fact, I was shot at on the way in with the little red car. So I definitely figured I needed something a bit stronger here. So I went to the Reuters guy, and I said, give me your car. And he was a friend. And he said, why? I said, there's a few civilians I want to get out. And he said, no. And I was furious with him. But I realize now that he was absolutely right, because the Serbs were all over the whole area. They were watching everything. And as soon as you cross that line as a journalist, it means they have license to say you're not behaving like a journalist. Other journalists are not behaving like journalists. We're going to expel you, beat you, lock you up, whatever, shoot at you, whatever it is. So that one little act of kindness might seem great at a very immediate level, but the consequences of it in far-reaching terms are going to be very, very negative. So even though at the time I was very angry, he did make the right decision. It was the right thing to do. It's the same thing with journalists carrying guns. You only need a few journalists carrying guns when suddenly their status changes completely, and they're then combatants. Especially if they shoot back, they're combatants. And if you're not going to shoot a gun, then why carry a gun in the first place? So it's not just your life you have to think about. It's everybody else's life as well. Sometimes it's very difficult. I was outside a theater in Moscow, and the Chechens, I don't know, the Chechen story is very complicated. I don't want you to go away thinking the Chechens are all bad. The Russians really, really smashed them to pieces. Anyway, there was Chechen terrorism, and they'd taken control of a theater, and there were about 45 or 50 Chechens and 800, 900 people in the theater. And the Russian special forces stormed the theater. And before they stormed it, they pumped a gas into the theater that knocked everybody out. And so I was there. I was there when I say I was there, I was in a building opposite. So I was 200 meters away, 100 meters away maybe. So after the shooting stopped, I went down and I came to the edge of the theater. I didn't know about the gas, because how would I have known? But I didn't go in the theater, which is probably just as well. And they started bringing out people and lying them down. And they weren't dead, but they were dying because they were choking. And they were lying them on their backs. And I know enough first aid to know that those people had to be turned over. They wouldn't have all survived, but some of them would have done, because they were choking, literally. But I'm standing there, there's special forces, there's FSB, which was Russian secret police, there's no medical equipment, backup whatsoever, and I'm thinking about how the hell do I do this in such a way that I don't just get arrested immediately. And I looked up and there was a guy watching me, And he could tell already that I shouldn't have been there. He just knew there was something about, he was looking at me, and he was FSB guy, and he was like, and I thought, in the end, the people dying right here, like 3 meters from me, 4 meters from me. And in the end, I thought, you know what, screw it, I've got to do something. And I took like 3 steps forward, and he came straight over and arrested me. So, difficult choices. Difficult choices. Yeah, maybe if you turn over one person, if you save one life, that's awesome. But sometimes is it more important to get the story out? Maybe it is. It depends. It's very, very difficult. That battle between being a human being and a journalist, there's no black and white lines there. There are grey lines. But you have to go beyond just thinking about your own kind of immediate selfish impulse, even if it's a good selfish impulse in a sense, and think about how that affects the big picture. Yeah, tricky. That's almost as difficult as your question, but not quite. Somebody else. I'm glad to see no one's gone to sleep. That's nice.
Thank you. I have one question. Maybe I should have checked it on the internet, but today Chechens are the biggest supporters of Putin. What happened in this time?
Oh gosh.
It's probably a long story.
It is a long story. It is a long story. How condensed do I make it? So basically, there were 2 Chechen wars. There was a Chechen war between 94 and 96, and then between 1999, about 2002, 3. Depends what you call the end of the war. I was in Chechnya a lot, 2002, 2003, 2004, I was there a lot. And I was there on both sides. I was there once with Russian special forces, but mostly I was there with Chechens. What happened? That country got smashed to pieces. It atomized. The Russians bought off some of the warlords. Some of them turned to the Russian side. The main one was a guy called Ahmed Kadyrov. I interviewed him, and he was killed about a week, 2 weeks afterwards, or 3 weeks afterwards. He was killed with a bomb. And his son, Ramzan Kadyrov, became the Chechen leader. He was only 27, I think, back then. Now he's older. Is Ramzan Kadyrov, I don't know, what's a polite word for this on camera? I mean, is he an arsehole? Yeah, he's a total arsehole, 100%. Does that mean that all the Chechens support him? No. It's like a Stalinist state, Chechnya. Anybody who stands up against Ramzan Kadyrov is risking their life, much more so than in Moscow, much more so. They've wiped out all the opposition. They've imprisoned everybody from homosexuals to minorities to, you know, it's difficult to blame somebody when it really is in some kind of Stalinist structure where the punishments are so huge for not standing up to oppose it. But do a lot of Chechens oppose what Kadyrov is doing in Ukraine? Yeah, absolutely. And there are Chechens fighting on the Ukrainian side as well, but they're not as organized, and there are not as many of them. I interviewed a woman in Kiev 5 years ago. She was very interesting. She was a Chechen, and she was a sniper. And she was one of the most successful Ukrainian snipers. She was fighting with the Ukrainian army in the Donbass. And weirdly, the Kremlin accused her husband, who was also a Chechen, of trying to kill Putin. It was like this strange accusation, and they insisted the Ukrainians hand him over. And the Ukrainians said no, and they sent a hit squad to try and kill him. And it's a dramatic story. So they sent a guy who was pretending to be a journalist. This is another problem. Suicide bombers dressed up as journalists. But anyway, this guy wasn't a suicide bomber, but they sent a guy, and he met the husband, and he met the woman whose name was Amina, and they met again. And the third interview, he said, I want to give you a present. And he took them in his car, got in the car, pulled out a pistol, and stuck 4 bullets into the guy. And the lady, Amina, who's this super cool, quite Islamically dressed, but very sort of fashionable, quite small Chechen woman, pulled out her Glock and stuck 8 bullets into the assassin. Everybody survived, incredibly. The husband survived, the assassin survived, and Amina survived. And then I interviewed her. I was with a photographer friend called Thomas Wojak. We interviewed her. He knew her, I didn't. We had lunch with her in Kiev. And about 2 months later, the Russians did it again, and they killed her. Second time they killed her. And he still survived, actually. He took some more bullets, but he's still alive. She's not. She was killed. And that was in Kiev. So this was a Russian assassination in Ukraine. So it's complicated. Chechen politics is complicated. Who else wants to ask Chechen tribal questions?
Or who wants to find out things about bears?
Any more questions, guys?
Have you seen bears here in Romania?
Have I seen bears in Romania? Certainly not recently. No, I haven't actually. I haven't. No, I lived here. I lived in Cluj, in Kolozsvár, in 1990. I was here during the revolution, and then I lived here in 1990. I was in Târgu Mures, Marosvásárhely, in March 1990 when they had a good old. I got smashed on the head by somebody with a piece of wood. I won't tell you what nationality he was, but he wasn't Romanian. And
that's not a full disclosure.
And yeah, I don't remember. That was when I lived here. After that, I left in 1991. I haven't lived here since. In fact, I didn't come back for a long time, and I don't remember ever seeing a bear here. Nice bear question to finish things off.
We're here in a safe, comfort space, comfortably space.
You think?
Yeah, it seems to me. Tell us about the situation when you felt completely insecure.
Gosh, completely insecure. I think there's two kinds of fear. There's the fear. Well, first of all, there's two kinds of danger. There's a danger that's past and a danger that is in front of you. When a bullet goes ping, it's dangerous. But actually it's not dangerous because the bullet has missed you. It's gone. It's not going to come back. So how we behave psychologically with that is completely different than if there's a guy on the street with a gun trying to shoot you. Because that's a kind of future danger, if you know what I mean. And I think fear is the same, or fear is similar. There are things that look safe, but are actually very dangerous. And there are things that look dangerous, but are actually quite safe, or relatively safe. The Albanian Revolution is an example of something that looked extremely dangerous. I mean, just continuous bullets everywhere, but they're all going in the sky. And yeah, now and then one comes down and kills somebody, or takes out their car, or their wheelbarrow, or whatever. But, so it seemed very dangerous, but actually it wasn't. Another typical example. Somebody steps out from behind a building and starts spraying Kalashnikov bullets. If you're 600 or 700 meters away, you're not in much danger. Somebody steps out from behind a building, stops, and takes one shot at you, you're in much greater danger. So some of these things are kind of counterintuitive, and we don't know enough always to judge what was dangerous and what was not. What specific example do I have? In Beslan, I had a bullet come in right next to me, into the wall right next to me. Did it upset me or faze me in any way? No. Because when you're looking at dead children, your own personal safety just doesn't seem to matter somehow, in the same way at least. Was it objectively dangerous? Yeah, it was objectively dangerous. I saw a Russian guy, he was quite close to me, he got hit here, and he died. I mean, he died quickly. He lost a lot of blood and he died. Was it an insecure situation? Yes, it was an insecure situation, but the drive to report that story properly, knowing that everybody was going to lie, the Russians were going to lie, the Chechens were going to lie, to get an accurate account of what was going on, was so strong and so important that these things were not insignificant perhaps, but less important than they otherwise would have been. People have often asked me, what's the closest you came to being killed? I just don't know. I don't know. Probably, I was going to say something facetious there, but I won't. What's the closest to being killed? I mean, I I fly a small aeroplane. maybe that's the closest. Yeah, and I crashed one as well. So maybe that's the closest I came to being killed. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was something else. Not a bear, anyway.
We're still here, waiting for your questions if you have.
I think we should let these poor people
Yeah.
go. They're looking slightly traumatized. Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for listening to two old guys talking about war. Cool. Thank you.